On January 1st, 2016, two things happened on the exact same day, and together they marked one of the last major turning points in a long, quiet transition away from the truly analog motorcycle. In the European Union, anti-lock brakes became mandatory on every new motorcycle over 125 cubic centimeters. And on that same morning, the Euro 4 emissions rules kicked in for new motorcycle designs. No headlines, no funeral. But if you wanted to build a motorcycle the old way, with carburetors you tune with a screwdriver, an air-cooled engine you can rebuild on your kitchen floor, and almost nothing electronic between your wrist and the rear wheel, that was the era it became increasingly difficult to sell one in the world's biggest markets. So this is the story of the motorcycles they will never build again. The loud ones, the raw ones, the ones that would try to kill you if you got cocky. And more importantly, it is the story of why they are gone and why they are not coming back, no matter how badly we want them to. Let's go back to the beginning. Picture a workshop in Stevenage, England in 1948. The Vincent factory rolls out a black V-twin called the Black Shadow, and it does something no production motorcycle had ever done. It topped out around 125 miles an hour at a time when most cars could not crack 70. A British magazine reviewed it and basically gave up trying to be objective, calling it a connoisseur's machine with speed and acceleration far beyond anything else on the road, and handing it 99 out of 100 marks. Then there is the photo. September of 1948, the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah. A man named Raleigh Free is trying to set a land speed record on the racing version of this bike, and he realizes his leathers are creating drag. So he strips down to a pair of swimming trunks, a borrowed bathing cap, and a pair of sneakers, lies flat on the bike like a man ironing himself onto the salt, and hits 150 miles an hour. That image is still one of the most famous photographs in all of motorcycling. A guy in his underwear doing 150 on a bike with no fairing, no electronics, no safety, anything. That was the spirit of the whole era right there. And the Black Shadow's reputation as the world's fastest production motorcycle endured for decades, long after the bike itself went out of production. We'll come back to why that matters. Vincent stopped building motorcycles in 1955. They were losing money on every bike they made. And that is the first crack in this whole story, the thing you will see again and again. The most special machines were almost never the most profitable ones. For the next decade, the British ruled. Triumph, Norton, BSA. If you wanted a fast, characterful bike in America in the early 1960s, you bought British. In fact, 1967 was Triumph's best year ever in the United States, with something like 28,000 bikes sold here. And by some accounts, they were taking more than half of America's entire over 500 cubic centimeter market by the end of that decade. They were on top of the world. And that, of course, is exactly when everything flipped. In late 1968, the British thought they had their answer to the future. BSA and Triumph launched a 3-cylinder machine, the Rocket 3 and the Trident, a genuinely fast, genuinely clever bike. They were proud of it. And then, 4 weeks later, Honda walked into the room and changed the rules of the game completely. The bike was the Honda CB750, and it's hard to overstate what it did. It hit American showrooms in 1969 for around $1,495, which is roughly $13,000 in today's money. And for that price, you got features that had rarely appeared together on an affordable production motorcycle before. A transverse 4-cylinder engine, an electric starter, so no more kicking your leg off on a cold morning, and a hydraulic disc brake on the front when almost everything else still used drums. It made 67 horsepower, ran to around 124 miles per hour, and a major magazine of the day flat out called it the most sophisticated production bike ever made. Honda sold over 400,000 of them, and the word people invented to describe it was superbike. Here's the part the British couldn't survive. The CB750 didn't just go fast, it started every time, and it delivered a level of reliability. The British twins, with their well-earned reputation for marking their territory on your garage floor, simply struggled to match. Japan had figured out that riders didn't actually want to be amateur mechanics. They just wanted to ride. And that reliability was the beginning of the end for an entire country's industry. Now, you would think the other Japanese companies would panic. Kawasaki did the opposite. They went bigger. Kawasaki had actually been working on their own 750 four-cylinder when the CB750 dropped, and instead of rushing out something second best, they made a brutal decision. They scrapped the plan and went back to the drawing board to build something that would make the Honda look small. 3 years later, in 1972, they unveiled it at the Cologne Motor Show. They had codenamed it New York Steak. The world knew it as the Z1. The Z1 had a 903 cubic centimeter double overhead cam, air-cooled inline 4 engine that made 82 horsepower and topped 125 miles per hour, which, if you remember that old Vincent from the start of the story, means it had established itself among the fastest production motorcycles in the world, in a class the British had owned a generation earlier. It won Machine of the Year 4 years running, and to prove it wasn't just fast but tough, Kawasaki took one to Daytona and set a 24-hour endurance record, averaging over 109 miles per hour for an entire day and night, covering more than 2,600 miles without braking. The Z1 locked in a recipe that would define motorcycles for the next 20 years. People started calling it the universal Japanese motorcycle. An air-cooled inline 4-sitting sideways in the frame, a row of carburetors, a row of exhaust pipes, 2 shocks in the back, and a riding position built for actual humans. Honda, Yamaha, Suzuki, all of them chased this same formula. And for a while, it felt like the good times would never end. But the 4-cylinder bikes weren't even the wildest things on the road, not by a long shot, because alongside them, the Japanese were building 2-strokes. And if you've never heard a big 2-stroke at full song, it's hard to explain what the fuss is about. A 2-stroke engine fires on every single revolution instead of every other one. It has no valves, just holes in the cylinder walls, and a much simpler set of moving parts. The result is an engine that's lighter, that makes power in a sudden violent rush, and that screams through its expansion chamber pipes in a way no 4-stroke ever could. The king of the scary ones was the Kawasaki H2 Mach 4. Built from 1971, it was a 2-stroke triple of 750 cubic centimeters, making 74 horsepower, and it was one of the fastest accelerating production motorcycles you could buy in 1972. 0 to 60 in around 4 seconds in 1972. The problem was the frame flexed, the power arrived all at once, and the front wheel had a real enthusiasm for pointing at the sky. Riders nicknamed it the Widowmaker. In Italy, they called it the Flying Coffin. Kawasaki sold about 47,000 of them anyway, because of course they did. Suzuki took the 2-stroke in a smoother direction with the GT750, the first mass-produced Japanese bike with a liquid-cooled engine. Americans called it the Water Buffalo, the British called it the Kettle. And Yamaha built the RD350 and RD400, lighter, cheaper, absolutely vicious little machines that turned an entire generation of teenagers into riders, and turned more than a few of them into cautionary tales. These bikes are gone in a way the 4-strokes aren't, and we'll get into exactly why. But hold on to that 2-stroke scream for a minute. It matters later. If the Japanese gave us speed and reliability, the Italians gave us soul, and the bike that proves it is the Ducati 750 SS. In April of 1972, Ducati showed up at a race in Imola, Italy, in front of 70,000 people with a strange-looking V-twin and a rider named Paul Smart, who they'd almost had to beg to show up. Smart won. And that victory turned into a road bike, the 750 Supersport, built in early 1974. Ducati only made about 401 of the original round case versions, which is part of why they're worth a fortune today. But the real magic was in the engine, designed by a man named Fabio Taglioni. Ducati used something called a desmodromic valve system. On a normal engine, springs pull the valves closed. Taglioni's design used a second set of cams to physically force them shut, no springs needed, which let the engine rev harder and faster. It's weird, it's complicated, it's very Italian, and Ducati still uses a version of it to this day as their signature party trick. In 1977, a privateer team took one of these bikes to Daytona and won the superbike race outright, averaging just over 100 miles an hour. Still one of the most important wins in Ducati's history. So by the mid-1970s, the menu was incredible. Japanese fours, screaming two-strokes, Italian exotics, British twins on their last legs, big lazy American V-twins. Now here's the question that actually matters. What did all of these machines have in common that we genuinely cannot get back? Let me break it down because this is the heart of it. First, carburetors. Every single one of these bikes mixed air and fuel with a mechanical device that has no fuel injection computer, no oxygen sensor, nothing reading the exhaust and adjusting on the fly. It works on suction and physics. The beautiful part is you can tune it in a parking lot with a screwdriver and a handful of little brass jets. The fatal part, as we will see, is that a carburetor cannot precisely control what comes out of the exhaust pipe. Second, AIR cooling. Most of these engines had no radiator, no coolant, no water pump, just fins cast into the metal to shed heat into the wind. They were simpler, lighter, and there was nothing to leak. But air-cooled engines run hotter and dirtier, and they cannot hold the precise temperatures that modern clean-burning engines need. Third, and maybe most important, there was little to no electronic intervention standing between you and the machine. No anti-lock brakes, no traction control, no ride modes, no computer deciding how much power to actually give you when you twisted the throttle. The throttle was a steel cable. You pulled it, the engine responded, and everything that happened after that was your problem. And fourth, the thing that ties it all together. Many owners could do most of the work themselves. You set the valve gaps with a feeler gauge, you timed the ignition with a strobe light, you synced the carburetors with a couple of gauges and a steady hand. There was no diagnostic port, no dealer-only software, no specialized electronics needed to read a fault code and tell you what was wrong. A reasonably handy person with a manual and a weekend could handle most of the maintenance on one of these machines. That is a big part of why people worship this era. Riders felt like they owned their machines completely. Now, hold that thought, because while riders were falling in love with all this, an entire industry was quietly dying. The British collapse is honestly hard to watch. Remember, Triumph owned more than half the American big bike market in the late 1960s. By 1972, BSA had stopped making motorcycles entirely. The companies got shoved together into a single rescue operation called Norton Villiers Triumph, propped up with millions in government money. And when management announced plans to shut the Triumph factory in a town called Meriden, the workers did not leave. They occupied their own factory and refused to let a single bike out the gates. That sit-in lasted around 18 months. Eventually, the government helped them form a workers' cooperative, and they kept building Triumphs by sheer stubbornness, but the writing was on the wall. The cooperative finally folded in 1983, and the factory was bulldozed the year after. The Triumph name only survived because a property developer named John Bloor bought it and started over completely from scratch. Meanwhile, in America, Harley-Davidson was going through its own version of this. In 1969, a company called AMF, which mostly made bowling equipment, bought Harley. Their big twin engine of the era was the Shovelhead, an air-cooled V-twin that, when it was running right, was glorious. The problem was, the AMF years became famous for cutting costs and letting quality slide. Bikes left the factory with problems. The reputation took a beating. It got so bad that in 1981, a group of Harley executives bought the company back themselves, and a few years later, replaced the Shovelhead with a new engine just to survive. I want to be fair here, because the AMF ruined Harley's story is the easy version. AMF also poured in the money that funded real improvements, and there are Shovelheads out there with hundreds of thousands of miles on them. But the point stands. The romantic era of motorcycling was, behind the scenes, a financial bloodbath. Quick pause, because if you're enjoying this deep dive into motorcycle history, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. I cover the stories behind the machines every single week, and it genuinely helps the channel keep going. Okay, so we've got this golden age of raw, simple, characterful machines. And we've got an industry that's barely holding itself together. Now we get to the part that actually killed the analog motorcycle. And it wasn't bankruptcy. It was a slow, decades-long tightening of the rules. And once you see the timeline laid out, you can't unsee it. It starts in 1978. That's the year the first real emission standards for street motorcycles took effect in the United States, with California pushing even harder. At first it was manageable. Manufacturers tweaked things, leaned out the carbs a little, and carried on. Then the screws started turning in Europe. In the late 1990s, the European Union introduced its first motorcycle emission standard, Euro 1, and from there it just kept ratcheting. Euro 2, Euro 3, Euro 4, Euro 5, each one demanding less pollution out of the exhaust pipe than the last. By the Euro 3 and Euro 4 era, roughly the late 2000s into the mid-2010s, the simple carburetor had effectively reached the end of the road. There was no practical way to make a carb precise enough to hit these targets across cold mornings, hot afternoons, sea level, and mountain passes. So manufacturers switched, almost universally, to electronic fuel injection. A computer now decided exactly how much fuel to spray, dozens of times a second, based on a web of sensors. Cleaner, yes. More efficient, yes. But that screwdriver and a jet kit world was over. And remember the two-strokes, the screaming ones? They were the first against the wall. A two-stroke burns oil along with its fuel and lets a chunk of that fuel escape straight out the exhaust before it even ignites. In emissions terms, that's a catastrophe. They never stood a chance. The last gasp in America is a genuinely poignant little story. The Yamaha RZ350, sold around 1984 and 1985, was the last mass-market two-stroke street bike Americans could buy. And to keep it legal even that long, Yamaha bolted on a catalytic converter, the first one ever fitted to a motorcycle sold in the United States. It didn't matter. Yamaha eventually killed it because keeping that dirty two-stroke on sale was eating into the emissions budget they needed for their bigger, more profitable four-strokes. In Europe, the two-stroke street bike hung on a little longer through a gorgeous Aprilia called the RS250, which made an absurd 60 horsepower from just 250 cubic centimeters, until tightening emissions laws finally finished it off around 2004. And that was that. The street two-stroke, one of the most thrilling kinds of machine ever built, was legislated out of existence. But emissions were only half of it. The other half was safety. On November 20th, 2012, the European Parliament voted overwhelmingly to make anti-lock brakes mandatory on every new motorcycle over 125 cubic centimeters, starting in 2016. Now, the anti-lock braking system, or ABS, saves lives, genuinely. I am not here to argue against it, but think about what it means for the machine. From that point on, there was no legal way to sell most new mid-size motorcycles in Europe without an electronic braking system on board. And once electronics earn a permanent place on the bike, more of them tend to follow. And they did follow. The first production bike with ABS appeared in 1988 on a BMW. The first bike with a fully electronic throttle, where the twist grip is not even connected to the engine by a cable anymore, but instead just sends a signal to a computer, arrived on a Yamaha in 2006. The first factory quickshifter, letting you bang through gears without the clutch, appeared on a BMW in 2008. And then around 2014 and 2015, bikes started getting these little motion sensing chips called IMUS that can tell exactly how far the bike is leaned over, so the traction control and ABS can adjust mid-corner. Lean-sensitive electronics. Computers managing your grip while you are cranked over in a turn. Put it all together, and a modern motorcycle relies on electronics in ways earlier generations never imagined. The engine, the brakes, the throttle, the traction, all of it managed and mediated by sensors and software. And here is the thing people get wrong. They think the manufacturers chose this because they are boring or greedy or out of touch. That is not it. A lot of this architecture is required to legally sell a bike in major markets at all. Building a brand new carbureted, air-cooled, electronics-free motorcycle and certifying it for mass sale in Europe or the US has become economically and legally impractical. The bike you are nostalgic for is not illegal to own or ride. It has become nearly impossible to mass produce as a new machine. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a market that is screaming the truth louder than any regulation ever could. Because if you want to know how much these old machines really meant, look at what people now pay to own a piece of that era. In 2018, a 1951 Vincent Black Lightning, the racing cousin of that bike we opened with, sold at auction for $929,000. At the time, the most expensive motorcycle ever sold. And just recently, in 2026, the Suzuki that Barry Sheene rode to a world championship back in 1977 hammered for 506,000 pounds, a record for a Japanese motorcycle, while a 1960s MV Augusta racer crossed the $1 million line. The big collector auctions now pull in millions of dollars in a single weekend, and the people running them say it plainly. Riders who had or desperately wanted these bikes when they were young are now coming back to buy the machines of their youth. But it is deeper than nostalgia. The reason these prices keep climbing is that the thing they represent is genuinely, permanently impossible to make again. You cannot walk into a dealership and buy a new motorcycle with 4 carburetors, points ignition, and a 4x4 exhaust. The laws that pushed all of that out are getting stricter every few years, never looser. And this is the part that really gets me. Look at the bikes wearing those legendary old names today. There is a new Triumph Bonneville, and it is a wonderful machine, but it is a liquid-cooled, fuel-injected, electronically throttled bike with anti-lock brakes and traction control wearing the silhouette of a 1959 classic. Honda even brought back the CB750 name, and that bike, for the first time in the model's entire history, uses fuel injection instead of carburetors. The name survived, but the engineering philosophy behind them changed dramatically. So let us go back to where we started. That man on the salt flats in 1948 in his swimming trunks, doing 150 miles an hour on a machine he could have torn down and rebuilt with his own hands in his own shed. That wasn't just a faster motorcycle. It was a completely different relationship between a person and a machine. Direct, mechanical, a little dangerous, entirely yours. What the riders mourn isn't really horsepower, because modern bikes have more of that than anyone could ever use. It's the directness of a throttle cable. It's the sound of metal moving instead of the quiet hum of a computer doing its job. It's the simple freedom of being able to fix the thing yourself on your own floor on a Sunday afternoon. That's what's gone. And the reason they'll never build motorcycles like that again isn't that they forgot how. The engineers never lost the knowledge. What changed was everything around them. Regulations, economics, and what riders came to expect all shifted until the kind of machine that defined the golden age was no longer something the industry was allowed or able to build at scale. The golden age isn't fading. It quietly closed years ago, one regulation and one model year at a time, while most of us were looking the other way. So here's what I'll leave you with. If you've ever had the chance to ride one of these old machines, really ride one, drop a comment and tell me which one, because those stories are the whole point. And if you're new here, subscribe and stick around, because next week we're digging into another machine the rule makers made impossible. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.